Victor didn't flinch as he pushed his pregnant wife off the rooftop. He watched his wife fall with the same detached interest one might show a discarded wrapper tumbling down a gutter. He stood on the edge of the penthouse roof, the wind tugging at his perfectly tailored black suit, and calmly adjusted his cufflinks. Amara was 7 months pregnant. As the gravity took her, her white dress snapped like a flag in the gale, and her natural curls clawed at the night sky. She didn't scream. The air was moving too fast for sound. Below her, the city lights were a blur of cold gold and predatory neon, 200 feet of empty space between her and the hard concrete of the plaza. Then the impossible happened. A shadow broke from the ledge just floors below, a man in a long dark coat who didn't just reach out. He launched himself into the void. Kai Draven didn't hesitate. He cut through the air like a blade, his silver hair a streak of light against the dark. Mid-fall, he collided with Amara, his strong arms locking around her, his coat billowing out like a dark wing. For a heartbeat, they were suspended against the skyline, a brief interruption of fate. To understand how Amara ended up at the edge of that roof, you have to understand the life Victor Hale had built for her. It was a masterpiece of domestic engineering, a world so polished and perfect it felt like living inside a high-end magazine spread. Their penthouse was all floor-to-ceiling glass and white marble, perched so high above the city that the people below looked like ants. Victor used to tell her it was because she deserved to be closer to the stars, but looking back, it was just easier to keep a bird in a cage when the cage was built in the clouds. Their marriage hadn't started with threats or cold stares. It started with the kind of attention that felt like a warm blanket. Victor was the man who remembered her favorite obscure tea brand, who knew exactly how she liked the pillows fluffed, and who spent hours listening to her talk about her dreams of opening a community art space. He was attentive, almost obsessively so. He'd check in 10 times a day, not with demands but with soft questions. Did you eat? Are you tired? Did you take your vitamins? At the time, Amara thought it was love. She thought she had finally found the one person in the world who truly saw her. In reality, Victor wasn't seeing her. He was monitoring her. He was a strategist, and Amara was his most valuable asset, not because he loved her, but because she was the perfect front. She had deep brown skin, a soft, trusting face, and a reputation for being kind and beyond reproach. In the high-stakes world of international finance and the darker shadows Victor moved in, Amara was the ultimate shield. Every shell company, every offshore account, and every questionable legal filing had her name on it. He spent 3 years curating her life, making her feel so safe and so cared for that she never felt the need to look at the papers he asked her to sign over dinner. "Just a formality, honey," he'd say, leaning over to kiss her forehead, the smell of his expensive cologne acting like a sedative. "I am just making sure you're taken care of if anything ever happens to me." And she believed him. She believed him because the life he gave her was so beautiful it felt dangerous to question it. If you're still here, still watching, still listening, then this story has you. Do me a quick favor before we go deeper. Hit that subscribe button. Because what happens next, you don't want to miss it. They spent their weekends on yachts and their evenings at charity galas where Victor would show her off like a trophy. He was the perfect husband, always standing just a half step behind her, his hand resting firmly on the small of her back. She thought it was a gesture of support. Now she realized it was a gesture of ownership. He was steering her, guiding her movements, making sure she stayed within the lines he had drawn for her. When she got pregnant, the attention shifted into overdrive. Victor became even more protective, even more rigid about her schedule. He hired private security, installed new cameras in the penthouse, and began vetting everyone she spoke to. He told her the world was becoming a dangerous place for a woman in her position. He made her feel like the apartment was the only safe place left on Earth, while slowly cutting the threads that connected her to her old friends and her family. He was building a wall, brick by brick, and calling it a sanctuary. Amara spent her days looking out those massive windows, her hand resting on her growing stomach, feeling incredibly lucky. She would watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold, thinking about the nursery they were decorating in soft creams and linens. She imagined Victor holding their daughter, his cold exterior melting away. She didn't realize that to Victor, the baby wasn't a miracle, it was a deadline. A child added a layer of complexity to his legal shield that he hadn't fully accounted for. A child meant a permanent link, a potential for inheritance disputes, and a new set of eyes on the paper trail he had spent years hiding. The Pinterest, life was a lie designed to keep her quiet and compliant. Every bouquet of lilies he brought home, every piece of jewelry he draped around her neck, and every soft word whispered in the dark was a tactical move. He was a man who played a long game, and for 3 years, Amara had been his favorite piece on the board. She was the face of his legitimacy, the soft, human mask he wore to hide the machine underneath. She had been living in a curated dream, never suspecting that the man who tucked her into bed every night was the same man who was already calculating the most efficient way to get rid of her once she was no longer useful. He had built the cage so beautifully that she had forgotten how to fly, which made it all the more terrifying when he finally decided to open the door and push. The change didn't happen with a scream or a grand confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon while Amara was looking for a pen. She had been sitting at the heavy mahogany desk in Victor's home office, trying to fill out a simple birth plan for the hospital. The room always felt colder than the rest of the penthouse, smelling of expensive leather and stale silence. She had checked the top drawers, then the side panels, but found nothing but organized stacks of stationery. When she reached into the very back of the deep bottom drawer, her wedding ring caught on a small, nearly invisible notch in the wood. She pulled, expecting a stuck folder, but instead, a narrow section of the wall panel behind the desk clicked and shifted forward. It was a hidden compartment, the kind of thing you see in movies and think is too dramatic to be real. Inside, there were no gold bars or weapons. There was only a single, matte black encrypted drive and a thin manila folder labeled with a string of alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to her. Amara opened the folder, her hand resting instinctively on her stomach as the baby kicked. She expected tax documents or perhaps some secret offshore investment Victor hadn't mentioned. What she found was a subject profile. At the top of the first page was her own driver's license photo, the one where she was smiling, taken just 2 weeks after their wedding. The language in the documents was clinical, stripped of any humanity. It didn't refer to her as a wife or even a person. She was the asset. As she flipped through the pages, the breath left her lungs. There were detailed logs of her daily movements, transcripts of her private phone calls with her mother, and a comprehensive list of every document she had ever signed. Next to each signature was a note explaining which shell company it protected and how many layers of legal insulation it provided Victor and the people he worked for. She was his fall girl. The realization hit her like a physical blow. If the authorities ever looked into the Hale group, the trail would lead directly to her curls and her brown skin, ending at her doorstep while Victor walked away clean. But it was the final page that turned her blood to ice. It was a document titled Liability Assessment. Notes were dated from the month she announced her pregnancy. The strategist had determined that a child created an unacceptable level of risk. A child meant a permanent legal heir that could complicate the dissolution of the shell companies. The recommendation at the bottom of the page was typed in a font that looked terrifyingly ordinary. Termination of subject prior to delivery. Status. Scheduled. Amara sat in the silence of the office, the paper trembling in her hand. The man who had kissed her that morning, who had rubbed lavender oil into her feet to help with the swelling, had already signed off on her death. He wasn't waiting for the baby. He was waiting for the right weather. The right location, the right accident. She looked around the room, and suddenly the white marble and the floor-to-ceiling glass didn't look like luxury anymore. They looked like a trap. The cameras in the corners of the ceiling weren't there for her protection. They were there to ensure she didn't find exactly what she was holding. She realized then that her entire life, the 3 years of soft words and beautiful dresses, had been a long, slow walk toward a cliff. She didn't cry. There wasn't enough air in her chest for tears. Instead, she felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over her. She tucked the black drive into the hidden pocket of her dress and slid the folder back into the wall, clicking it shut. She wiped her face and walked out of the office, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When Victor came home an hour later, he was smiling. He brought her a box of the expensive chocolates she liked and asked how the baby was moving. Amara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the predator behind the tailored suit. She realized she had been married to a ghost, a hollow man who had mapped out the end of her life while she was busy planning the beginning of their child's. She thanked him for the chocolates, her voice steady even as her soul screamed. She knew she couldn't run yet. He had eyes everywhere, and he was too smart to let an asset just walk out the front door. She had to play the part of the trusting, fragile wife for just a little longer. She had to wait for him to make his move, but for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't the one being guided. She was the one watching the clock, knowing that the man she loved was actually her executioner, and the only way to save her daughter was to let him think he had already won. The sensation of falling isn't like what you see in the movies. There is no grace in it, no slow-motion realization. It is a violent, deafening roar of wind that strips the breath from your lungs before you can even process the betrayal. As Amara left the ledge of the penthouse, the world tilted into a chaotic blur of gray sky and the cold, sharp edges of the skyscraper's glass skin. For a split second, she looked up and saw Victor's silhouette, a dark, motionless pillar against the clouds, already growing smaller. He wasn't reaching for her. He wasn't even looking away then. The air around her changed. It wasn't the impact of the street that hit her, but a sudden, massive weight from the side. Kai Draven didn't just catch her. He intercepted her trajectory with the precision of a predator. He had timed his leap from a lower terrace, calculating the physics of their falling bodies in a way that seemed to defy the panic of the moment. When his arms locked around her, it was like being hit by a freight train made of muscle and heavy wool. The force of the midair collision knocked the last bit of oxygen out of her, but his grip was absolute. One hand was buried in the fabric of her dress, anchoring her weight, while the other shielded her head and her stomach, tucking her into the hollow of his chest. His long, dark coat whipped around them both, a frantic, snapping shroud that hissed in the wind. Amara felt the vibration of a grunt deep in his chest, the sound of a man straining against the sheer momentum of 2 lives accelerated by gravity. They weren't floating. They were plummeting. Kai's boot struck a decorative ledge 3 stories down, the impact sending a jarring shock through both of them that felt like it might snap bone. He didn't stop. He used the momentum to roll, absorbing the energy of the fall, his body acting as a human shock absorber between Amara and the cold stone. They tumbled over the edge of the ledge, falling another 10 feet onto a lower balcony, then sliding down a steep glass canopy that shrieked under their weight. The world was a series of hard hits and sudden drops. Amara's eyes were squeezed shut, her fingers clawing into the sleeves of Kai's coat, the only solid thing in a universe that had gone liquid. She could feel the heat radiating off him despite the freezing rain, a frantic, living energy that refused to let go. Every time they hit a surface, he repositioned himself, taking the brunt of the glass, the metal, and the stone. The final descent was a desperate scramble. Kai kicked off a maintenance ladder, steering their tangled bodies toward a massive pile of discarded construction insulation and heavy tarps in the alleyway below. They hit the mound with a sickening thud that sent a cloud of dust and plastic into the air. Silence followed, heavy and thick. Amara lay gasping, her heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst through her ribs. She was alive. Her hands moved instinctively to her stomach, feeling the hard, protective curve of her baby. The child kicked, a sharp, frantic movement, and Amara let out a sob that was half joke, half laugh. Kai was already moving. He rolled off the pile, his silver hair matted with blood and dust, his dark coat torn to ribbons. He didn't ask if she was okay, he didn't have the breath for it. He grabbed her arm, his eyes scanning the heights of the building they had just escaped. High above, the penthouse lights were still glowing, a serene and beautiful lie. Victor would be looking down now. He would be waiting to see two bodies on the pavement, but the alley was dark and tucked away. "Look up," Kai rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel, raw and urgent. "If you look up, he wins. Move." He pulled her to her feet. Amara's legs felt like water, her bare feet stinging against the grit of the alley floor. She was shivering uncontrollably now, the adrenaline beginning to ebb and the cold reality of the rain soaking through her white dress. She looked at this stranger, this man who had thrown himself into the sky just to catch a falling woman he didn't even know. He looked like a ghost, or a demon, or an angel. She couldn't tell which. All she knew was that his hand was warm, and it was the first hand that hadn't been trying to steer her toward a grave. They moved into the shadows of the city, two broken figures blending into the rain. Behind them, the skyscraper stood tall and indifferent, a monument to the man who thought he had ended her story. But as Kai pulled her into the back of a nondescript black car idling at the end of the alley, Amara realized the fall wasn't the end. It was the moment the ground finally became real. The Pinterest life was gone, shattered on the pavement she had never hit. Now there was only the cold, the dark, and the sudden, fierce necessity of staying alive. The safe house was a basement apartment that smelled of damp concrete and old paper, tucked underneath a laundromat in a part of the city Victor would never have stepped foot in. The rhythmic thumping of the industrial dryers overhead was the only sound, a dull heartbeat that felt more honest than the silence of the penthouse. Kai didn't talk much. He had stripped off the remains of his dark coat and was hunched over a folding table covered in glowing monitors and tangled wires. The blue light from the screens caught the silver in his hair and the sharp, tired line of his jaw. He was monitoring the grid, watching the digital ripples Victor was making as he tried to confirm Amara's death. To the world, the rooftop was a tragedy. To Kai, it was a data point. Amara sat on a narrow cot, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket that scratched her skin. She wasn't looking at the screens. She was looking at the wall, but she wasn't seeing the peeling paint. She was replaying the last 3 years of her life, but this time, she was watching them with the sound turned off. When you take away the soft music, the expensive dinners, and the whispered promises, a marriage looks very different. She thought about the time Victor had surprised her with a spontaneous trip to the coast. At the time, Shed felt like the luckiest woman alive. Now, watching the memory without the sound of his affection, she saw how he'd spent the whole trip on his phone, how he'd insisted she sign a stack of travel insurance papers before they boarded the boat, and how he'd carefully photographed her in front of a specific office building. He hadn't been taking a vacation. He'd been establishing her presence at a crime scene. She replayed the nights he'd come home late and held her so tight it almost hurt. Shed thought it was passion. Now she realized it was a check. He was feeling for the drive, checking her pockets, making sure the asset hadn't been poked or prodded by anyone else. He wasn't holding her, he was auditing her. "He never loved me," she said quietly. The words didn't feel like a discovery, they felt like a heavy stone Shed finally decided to stop carrying. Not for a single second. Kai didn't look up from his monitors, but his typing slowed. "Men like Victor Hale don't love people, Amara. They love leverage. You were the best leverage he ever had." "I was a signature," she whispered, her hand moving to her stomach. "That's all. A clean name on a dirty contract." She thought about the nursery again, the soft linens and the hand-carved crib. She remembered Victor standing in the doorway of that room, looking at the wallpaper Shed picked out. She had thought he was imagining their daughter sleeping there. Now, with the subtitles of truth running across the memory, she saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't looking at a nursery. he was looking at a liability. He was wondering if a baby would make her harder to control, harder to dispose of, or harder to blame. The betrayal wasn't just the push off the roof. It was the thousands of tiny, curated moments that led up to it. Every kiss had been a bribe. Every compliment had been a distraction. He had built a museum of her life and invited her to live in it, while he worked in the basement, digging her grave. "He's searching the hospitals," Kai said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "He's calling in favors with the police to see if a body was recovered from the plaza. He's nervous." "Should be," Amara said. She felt a strange, cold heat rising in her chest. For 3 years she had been the soft one, the one who deferred, the one who trusted. But Victor had made a tactical error. He had assumed that because she was kind, she was weak. He had assumed that once he took away the penthouse and the dresses, there would be nothing left of her. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She was waking up. The Pinterest version of Amara Cole had died the moment her feet left that ledge. The woman sitting in this basement was someone else, someone who knew exactly how the machine worked because she had been its heart for 3 years. "He thinks he's the strategist," Amara said, her voice gaining a sharp, steady edge. "But he forgot one thing. I am the one who signed the papers. I am the one whose name is on every single account he owns. If I am dead, he's safe. But if I am alive... If you're alive," Kai finished, finally turning to look at her, "you're the only person on earth who can burn his world down." Amara nodded. She closed her eyes, letting the last of the fake memories fade away. She didn't need the soft music or the lavender oil anymore. She needed to know how to fight. She watched the blue light of the monitors dance behind her eyelids and realized that for the first time in her marriage, she finally understood exactly who Victor Hale was. And more importantly, she was starting to understand exactly who she had to become to survive him. The 4th day in the safe house was the day the silence changed. Until then, the noise of the city and the thumping of the laundromat upstairs had been a source of anxiety for Amara, a chaotic reminder of how close the world was and how easily it could break in. But Kai didn't want her to be afraid of the noise. He wanted her to own it. He sat her in the center of the room on a wooden chair, her hands resting on the protective curve of her stomach. The blue light of the monitors was dimmed, leaving the room in a hazy, gray twilight. Kai stood by the door, his silhouette tall and unmoving. "Close your eyes," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the soft, condescending sweetness Victor used to use. It was a tool, sharp and functional. "Your eyes are easy to trick. Victor spent 3 years tricking your eyes with marble and jewelry, but the ears don't lie. Sound has a weight, it has a direction." Amara hesitated, her fingers twitching against her white dress, which was now stained with the grit of their escape. She closed her eyes. At first, it was just a wall of static. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant hiss of traffic, the rhythmic vibration of the dryers. "Tell me what you hear upstairs," Kai commanded. "Machines," she whispered. "Just the laundry." "Listen deeper, under the machines." Amara focused. She let her breath slow, feeling the baby move in response to the quiet. Gradually, the static broke apart into layers. "There's a heavy step," she said, her voice growing steady. "Left side. It stops every few seconds. Someone is loading a front reacher. And there's a metallic jingle, keys on a belt, not in a pocket. That's the attendant. He's tired. He drags his right heel." "Good," Kai said, and she heard the faint rustle of his coat as he moved. "Now listen to the door behind you, not the one I am standing by, the service hatch." Amara turned her head slightly, keeping her eyes shut. She heard the wind whistling through a gap in the frame, a thin, high-pitched reed sound. But beneath it there was a faint metallic clicking. "The heat is expanding the pipes," she said. "But the click is rhythmic. It's a cooling vent. It's an exit, isn't it?" "It leads to the alleyway behind the grocery store," Kai confirmed. "If someone comes through the front, you don't look for a weapon, Amara. You aren't a soldier. You are a ghost." You move toward the sound of the wind. Every room has a heartbeat. If the heartbeat skips, you leave. For the next 3 hours, they didn't talk about the past or the betrayal. They talked about the architecture of survival. Kai walked her through the basement, not letting her open her eyes, making her touch the walls to find the hidden latches he had installed. He taught her how to count paces in the dark and how to recognize the specific mechanical groan of the elevator that meant someone was descending to their level. It was a strange, intense kind of intimacy. Victor had spent years making her feel fragile, like a porcelain doll that needed to be kept in a climate-controlled room. Kai treated her like a person who was about to go to war. He didn't apologize for the hardness of the floor or the coldness of the room. He gave her the one thing Victor never had: agency. "Your instinct isn't just about fear anymore," Kai said, standing close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "It's about the life you're carrying. That baby is a sensor. She feels your heart rate. When you're calm, she's calm. If you panic, you both lose. You have to be the steadiness in the center of the storm." Amara opened her eyes. The room looked different now. It wasn't a basement, it was a map. She looked at the service hatch, the ventilation duct, and the heavy iron door. She knew the distance to each one. She knew which floorboard creaked and which pipe leaked. She realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for someone to tell her she was safe. She was learning how to ensure it. "Why are you doing this?" Amara asked, looking at the silver-haired man who had literally fallen from the sky for her. "You could have dropped me at a police station. You could have stayed in the shadows." Kai looked at the monitors, the scrolling lines of code reflecting in his eyes. "I've spent a long time watching men like Victor build empires out of people like you," he said quietly. "I got tired of watching the empires win." He handed her a small, encrypted radio and a pair of sturdy shoes he'd acquired earlier. They were a far cry from the designer heels shed left on the rooftop, but as Amara pulled them on, she felt a different kind of power. She wasn't the asset anymore. She wasn't a signature on a page. She stood up, her natural curls messy and her brown skin pale under the flickering fluorescent light, but her shoulders were back. She listened to the building. She heard the laundry attendant upstairs finishing his shift. She heard the rain starting to tap against the sidewalk vents. She heard her own heart, slow and deliberate. She was 7 months pregnant. She was a fugitive, and she was being hunted by the man who had promised to love her forever. But as she looked at Kai, Amara realized that the protective instincts she was hunting weren't just for her child. They were for the woman she was becoming, the one who would eventually stop running and start making some noise of her own. The air in the basement felt thinner as the night wore on, thick with the smell of ozone from the overworked computers and the cooling coffee that had gone bitter hours ago. Amara watched the lines of code scrolling across Kai's monitors. To her, it looked like a foreign language, but to Kai, it was a map of a ghost kingdom. For hours, they had been hammering at the encryption keys they'd pulled from the black drive Amara had stolen from the penthouse. Every time they broke through a layer of security, they found another wall, another shell company, another fake identity. Victor's name was everywhere. It was on the deeds to warehouses in Singapore, the payroll for a private security firm in Eastern Europe, and the registration for a fleet of nondescript cargo ships. "He's so careful," Amara whispered, leaning in closer. "Every signature of mine is backed by 3 of his. He really did think he was the king of this world." Kai didn't answer right away. He was leaning back in his chair. His eyes narrowed as he watched a specific set of data packets move across the screen. He wasn't looking at where the money went. He was looking at where the orders came from. "Victor is a manager, Amara," Kai said, his voice flat. "A high-level employee with a very expensive tailor, but look at the timestamp on these authorization codes." He pointed to a string of numbers at the bottom of a termination order for a warehouse manager who had gone missing 6 months ago. The order had been sent at 3 in the morning. Amara remembered that night. Victor had been in bed next to her, his breathing heavy and even, his arm draped across her waist. He hadn't touched a computer all night. If Victor didn't send it, who did? She asked. Kai didn't speak. He tapped a few keys, bypassing a secondary firewall that looked like a standard banking portal. The screen flickered, and then a new interface appeared, one that was stripped of the corporate logos and the polished branding of the Hale Group. This was the skeleton of the operation. As the data populated, Amara felt a coldness settle in her bones that had nothing to do with the dampness of the safe house. Victor's name started to disappear from the top of the hierarchy. In this deeper layer, he was listed as a regional facilitator. Above him, there were no more boards of directors or CEOs. There was only one designation, the architect. "Crack the correspondence," Kai muttered, more to himself than to her. The server groaned, the fans on the hardware spinning into a high-pitched whine. Suddenly, the screen filled with thousands of short, clinical messages. They weren't from Victor. They were addressed to him. They were instructions, written with a chilling lack of emotion. They told Victor when to move money, which politicians to bribe, and eventually exactly when and how to vacate the asset. The coded phrase for Amara's death. Amara reached out, her finger trembling as she touched the screen. She recognized the syntax. She recognized the specific, icy precision of the language. It wasn't the way Victor talked. Victor was a man of grand gestures and dramatic pauses. This person was a machine. "It's not Victor," she breathed. "He's just the face. He's the one who takes the risks, so this person stays in the dark." "A classic structure," Kai said, his jaw tight. "You build a frontman who loves the spotlight, someone who is greedy enough to think he's in charge. But the person holding the leash never even enters the building." Amara felt a wave of nausea. She had spent 3 years fearing Victor's temper and craving his approval, thinking he was the center of her universe. Now she realized she had been married to a puppet. The man who had pushed her off the roof hadn't even come up with the idea. He had been following an order from someone who viewed her life as nothing more than a line of bad debt that needed to be erased. "Who is it?" she asked. Kai scrolled to the very top of the root directory, through layers of encryptions that had been designed to look like random noise. He paused on a single digital signature used to authorize the final payment for the disposal of the penthouse asset. It wasn't a name. It was an old family crest, a small, stylized hawk, and a set of initials that made Amara's heart stop. The initials belonged to Victor's mother, a woman Amara had met only twice, a woman who lived in a quiet, secluded estate in the countryside and supposedly spent her days gardening and collecting antique lace. The realization was a different kind of fall. Victor wasn't the monster she had to defeat. He was just the wall standing in front of the real one. The warmth she thought she had found in the Hale family, the sense of belonging she had craved, was a carefully constructed trap managed by a woman who had been calculating Amara's expiration date since the day of the wedding. "They aren't just a criminal organization, Amara," Kai said, his voice bringing her back to the room. "It's a dynasty, and you're the only person who has ever seen the inner workings and survived." Amara looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. Her brown skin looked gray in the light, her curls wild and unkempt. She looked nothing like the polished wife Victor had wanted. She looked like a survivor. "Victor thinks he's safe because he thinks he killed me," Amara said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "And his mother thinks she's safe because she's invisible. They think they've cleaned the slate." She looked at Kai, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something like respect in his eyes. "We don't just go after Victor," she said. "We go after the architect. I want to see her face when she realizes the asset she tried to terminate is the one who's going to take her throne." Kai nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Then we stop hiding. We start digging into the architect's private accounts. If we can link her signature to the termination order, the whole dynasty collapses." Amara turned back to the screen. The thumping of the laundry machines upstairs felt like a war drum now. The Pinterest life was a ghost, and the man she thought was her husband was a lie. But the architect was real, and for the first time, Amara wasn't the one being watched. She was the one doing the hunting. The rain didn't fall in the city anymore. It just hung in the air like a wet shroud, blurring the neon signs and turning the pavement into a mirror. The urban hideout was a derelict recording studio on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of damp insulation and old cigarettes. It was supposed to be a dead zone, a place where the grid couldn't reach, but the air felt heavy. Amara was sitting on a plastic crate, her back against the soundproof foam of the wall, when she felt it. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in the building's heartbeat. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent jab, and Amara froze. She didn't look at Kai. She just closed her eyes and listened the way he had taught her in the basement. Beneath the distant hum of the city's plumbing, there was a new rhythm. It was the synchronized, muffled thud of rubber-soled boots on the fire escape 2 floors down. It was too precise to be a neighbor. Then the elevator groaned. It wasn't the usual mechanical whine. It was the sound of the lift being held on the 3rd floor. They were cutting off the exits. "Kai," she whispered. He was already moving, his silver hair aflash in the dim light as he began disconnecting the hard drives. "I see them. An elite extraction team. Victor didn't send the police, he sent the architect's personal shadow. They're on the fire escape and the stairs," Amara said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. 3 on the north side. 2 in the hall. Kai looked at her, a brief flash of surprise in his eyes. She had read the sound perfectly. "The drainage ditch," he said. "The maintenance tunnel we mapped out, can you make it?" "I have to," she said. They didn't have time for a plan. The door at the end of the hallway splintered with a muffled crack, a suppressed breaching charge. Kai grabbed his bag and shoved a small, heavy radio into Amara's hand. "Go to the service hatch. I'll pull them toward the roof. If you hear 3 clicks on the radio, you run for the car at the grocery lot. Don't wait for me." Amara moved. She didn't run. Running made too much noise. She stayed low, her hands guiding her belly as she slipped through the narrow service hatch they had scouted. The crawl space was tight and smelled of rusted iron, but she moved with a grace she hadn't known she possessed. She wasn't the woman in the white fitted dress anymore. She was a ghost in the machine. As she reached the vertical shaft that led to the basement drainage system, she heard the heavy boots enter the studio above her. She heard the clack-clack of weapons being readied and the low, muffled commands of men who were paid to be invisible. She held her breath, pressing her body against the cold metal of the vent. A shadow passed over the grate above her. She could see the tip of a tactical boot. The man stopped. He was listening for a heartbeat, for a sob, for the rustle of a dress. Amara didn't give it to him. She thought of the lighthouse, the ocean, and the cold blue light of the monitors. She made her heart a stone. The man moved on, lured away by the sound of Kai intentionally knocking over a metal rack on the floor above. Amara slid down the maintenance ladder, the rungs biting into her palms. She reached the bottom, a dark, narrow tunnel where the city's runoff rushed in a black torrent. It was slippery and smelled of salt and oil, but she remembered Kai's map. 10 paces to the junction. Turn toward the sound of the wind. Asterisk, she waded through the ankle-deep water, her eyes adjusted to the dark. Every splash felt like a gunshot, but she timed her movements to the rhythmic thumping of the subway line running parallel to the tunnel. She was using the city to hide her own heartbeat. She reached the exit, a heavy iron grate that opened into a drainage ditch behind a row of industrial dumpsters. She pushed it open, the metal groaning softly. She crawled out into the wet grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The air was cold, but it felt like freedom. She looked back at the recording studio. High above, she saw the flicker of flashlights against the windows and heard the distant, muffled pops of engagement. Kai was dancing with them, leading them into a labyrinth he had already rigged. Her radio clicked. Once, twice, 3 times. Amara didn't look back again. She turned and ran toward the grocery store parking lot, her boots splashing through the puddles. She was barefoot in her mind, but solid on her feet in reality. She reached the nondescript black car, the engine already idling, and slid into the back seat. A minute later, the door opened and Kai tumbled in, smelling of smoke and rain. His silver hair was disheveled, and there was a fresh cut across his cheek, but he was smiling, a small, dangerous turn of the lips. "They think you drowned in the tunnel," he panted, putting the car into gear. "They're reporting a successful termination." Amara leaned back against the seat, her hand resting on her stomach. The baby was quiet now, as if she knew the danger had passed. "Let them think that," Amara said, watching the lights of the city blur in the window. "The architect thinks the asset is gone." She's going to be very surprised when the audit starts. They drove away from the concrete jungle, leaving the hunters behind in the dark. Amara wasn't the victim who fell from the roof anymore. She was the one who had navigated the dark, read the sounds of her enemies, and walked out of a closing net. She was alive, she was angry, and for the first time in her life, she was the one who was truly invisible. The confrontation didn't happen in a dark alley or a hidden warehouse. It happened in the one place Victor Hale felt most invincible, the glass-walled boardroom of the Hale Group, overlooking the city that he thought he owned. He was sitting at the head of the long marble table, his black suit as crisp as the day he had pushed her, looking over a revised merger agreement that would finally scrub Amara's name from his history. When the heavy double doors swung open, Victor didn't even look up. "I told you no interruptions," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Even for your wife, Victor." The sound of Amara's voice hit the room like a physical shock. Victor froze. His hand, still holding an expensive fountain pen, trembled just enough to leave a small ink blot on the paper. He looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, Amara saw a crack in the mask. His face went a sickly shade of gray, his eyes wide as they traveled from her face to her natural curls down to her white dress and finally to the unmistakable curve of her stomach. She looked like a ghost that had refused to stay buried. "Amara," he breathed, the name sounding like a curse. "Yurei, you should be dead." "I know," she said, walking toward the table. She didn't look fragile anymore. She didn't look like the woman who needed him to remind her to take her vitamins. She looked like the person who had spent weeks learning the rhythm of his breathing and the secrets of his servers. "But as it turns out, I am much better at surviving than you are at murder." Victor recovered quickly, the predator's instinct taking back over. He stood up, smoothing his jacket. "I don't know how you got in here, but you're trespassing. This building is secure. Whatever game you're playing with this man." He flicked a dismissive glance at Kai, who stood silently by the door. "It ends now." "You're right, Victor. It does end," Amara said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single tablet, sliding it across the marble surface until it stopped right in front of him. On the screen was a live dashboard of every shell company, every offshore account, and every liability assessment file they had pulled from the architect's server. At the bottom of the screen was a blinking red button labeled, "Execute Global Audit." What is this? Victor sneered, though his eyes were darting frantically across the data. "It's my signature, Victor," Amara said, her voice low and steady. "The one thing you spent 3 years turning into a weapon. You used it to hide your crimes, thinking that if the world ever found out, it'd be the one to go to jail. You made me the legal owner of everything you built." She leaned over the table, her brown skin glowing under the harsh office lights. "But as the legal owner, I have the right to call for a full, transparent audit of every single entity tied to my name. I've already sent the authorization to the federal authorities and the international banking regulators. They're just waiting for one final digital confirmation." Victor laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. "You wouldn't. You'd go down with me. You signed those papers, Amara." "You're the one who will be in handcuffs." "No," Amara said, and for the first time she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Because Kai and I found the correspondence. We found the orders from your mother. We found the termination order you signed for your pregnant wife. I'm not a co-conspirator, Victor. I'm a victim and a whistleblower. I've already been granted immunity in exchange for this data." Silence that followed was heavy. Victor looked at the tablet, then at the doors, then back at Amara. He realized the trap had flipped. The asset hadn't just survived, she had taken the one thing he valued more than her life, his safety. "Amara, let's talk about this," Victor said, his voice dropping into that soft, manipulative tone she used to love. "We can fix this. We're a family. Think about the baby. She needs a father who isn't behind bars." "She needs a father who didn't try to dash her against the pavement for a tax break," Amara replied. She looked at her wedding ring, the one she had never taken off until that morning. She pulled it from her finger and dropped it onto the tablet, right over the audit button. The weight of the diamond clicked against the glass. "You told me once that you were a strategist," she said, "but you forgot the most basic rule. Never give your shield a reason to hate you. Amara pressed her thumb against the biometric scanner on the screen. The red button turned green, and a progress bar began to fly across the display. In that second, billions of dollars in laundered assets were frozen. Legal alerts began hitting the phones of every syndicate member in 3 different time zones. The architect's kingdom was being dismantled by the very name she had used to hide it. Victor collapsed back into his chair, his posture finally breaking. He looked small. He looked like a man who had finally run out of moves. Amara didn't wait to see the police arrive. She didn't need to see him in handcuffs to know he was finished. She turned and walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm on the marble floor. Kai was waiting for her, his hand on the door, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. As they stepped into the elevator, Amara felt the baby kick. It wasn't a frantic movement this time. It was soft and rhythmic. For the first time in years, Amara breathed in the air of the city and didn't feel like she was suffocating. She hadn't used a gun or a blade. She had used the very thing Victor had tried to steal from her, her name. And as the elevator descended toward the street, she knew that the woman who reached the bottom wouldn't be a victim. She would be free. The morning light was different here. It didn't have the cold, sterile glare of the penthouse marble or the flickering neon anxiety of the city. In this small garden, tucked away where the air smelled of salt and damp earth, the sun felt like a hand resting gently on Amara's shoulder. She sat on a weathered wooden bench, her deep brown skin catching the warmth of the early rays. In her arms, wrapped in a soft cotton blanket that didn't cost a fortune but felt better than silk, was her daughter. The baby was 3 weeks old now, a tiny, breathing miracle with a head of dark curls that mirrored Amara's own. She was sleeping with a deep, quiet intensity, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was finally, truly safe. Amara looked out at the overgrown garden. A few months ago, she would have seen the weeds as a failure of maintenance, a flaw in the Pinterest perfection she'd been taught to maintain. Now she saw the life in them. The way the vines climbed the fence and the flowers grew wherever they pleased felt honest. There was no strategist here, no architect mapping out the expiration date of her happiness. Kai was a few yards away, leaning against the porch railing. He wasn't monitoring a grid or checking for tactical boots on a fire escape. He was just holding a mug of coffee, watching the horizon where the ocean met the sky. He had traded his heavy dark coat for a simple sweater, and the silver in his hair looked less like a streak of lightning and more like a part of the morning mist. He didn't say anything, and Amara didn't need him to. They had shared enough adrenaline and shadows to last a lifetime. They were both learning to be comfortable with the silence of peace. The news from the city had reached them in fragments. Victor was in a high-security facility, his tailored suits replaced by orange polyester. The architect's dynasty had crumbled under the weight of the audit Amara had triggered, the legal signatures that were meant to be her shroud becoming the very ropes that tied the syndicate together for the authorities. The empire was gone, and with it, the woman who had lived inside it. Amara looked down at her daughter and realized the heaviest thing she had been carrying wasn't the baby, but the weight of her own blind trust. For years, she had mistaken surveillance for care and control for love. She had handed over her name and her life to a man who saw her as an asset to be managed. That version of her, the one who kept her eyes closed and her heart open to a predator, was gone. She had left her on that rooftop. She didn't regret the fall. If she hadn't left the ledge, she would still be a signature on a page, waiting for a deadline she didn't know existed. The fall had stripped away the lies, and the water had washed off the makeup, leaving behind someone she was finally starting to recognize. She was a woman who could read the sound of a closing net, who could dismantle an empire with a thumbprint, and who could protect her child in the dark. A light breeze moved through the garden, shaking a few drops of dew from the leaves. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't look for the exits. She just adjusted the blanket around her daughter and leaned her head back, closing her eyes to feel the sun. She's waking up, Kai said softly, his voice carrying across the grass. Amara looked down. Her daughter's eyes fluttered open, dark, clear, and curious. She wasn't looking for a strategist or a protector. She was just looking at her mother. She's going to grow up with a different name, Amara whispered, more to herself than to Kai. A name that belongs only to her. No shell companies. No liability assessments, just her. A good view, Kai said, coming over to sit on the edge of the porch steps. Amara looked out at the garden again. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't curated. It was just a small patch of earth at the edge of the world. But as she watched the sunlight play across the grass, she realized the ghosts of the penthouse had finally stopped following her. The view wasn't haunted anymore. She had survived the push, survived the hunt, and survived the truth. Now, for the first time in her life, she was just a woman in a garden, holding her daughter, waiting for nothing more than the next quiet breath. She had finally learned that the only person she needed to trust was herself, and as she watched her daughter's tiny hand reach up to catch the light, Amara knew that was more than enough. The story of Amara Cole isn't just about a rooftop rescue or the collapse of a criminal empire. It's about the quiet, dangerous space between who we are told to be and who we actually are. If there is one thing you should take away from Amara's journey, it's that your greatest vulnerability can often be the source of your greatest power. Amara was chosen by Victor and the architect specifically because she was kind, because she was a mother, and because she was soft. They thought those traits made her a perfect shield, someone who would never look under the hood of her own life. They were wrong. Her kindness wasn't a weakness. It was the very thing that gave her the clarity to burn their world down once the mask slipped. The first lesson here is about the danger of blind trust. We often mistake comfort for safety. Amara lived in a penthouse in the clouds, surrounded by everything she ever wanted, but she was living in a cage built of silence and curated lies. True safety doesn't come from the walls around you or the person standing next to you. It comes from having your eyes open. It's about being brave enough to look for the black drive in your own life, even when you're afraid of what you might find. Awareness is the only thing that truly makes you unhackable. The second lesson is that the person who survives isn't the one who never gets knocked down. It's the one who refuses to let the fall be the ending. Amara was 200 feet in the air, falling toward what should have been her certain death. But instead of giving up, she reached out. She learned to read the sound of the wind, to navigate the dark, and to use the very systems designed to destroy her as the tools for her liberation. You are never as helpless as the world wants you to believe. Even when you are pushed, even when you are falling, you still have a signature. You still have a voice. Finally, this story reminds us that justice isn't always a loud explosion or a Hollywood shootout. Sometimes, justice is a signature on a digital audit. It's the steady, quiet refusal to be a victim anymore. Amara didn't need to become a monster to defeat the architect. She just had to stop being a ghost. She reclaimed her name, and in doing so, she reclaimed her future and the future of her daughter. If this story hit home for you, if you were gripped from that first rooftop plunge all the way to that sunlit garden, then you know that these are the kinds of conversations we need to keep having. Real survival isn't about luck. It's about the moment you decide you have nothing left to lose. If you want more stories that challenge the way you see the world, stories that dive deep into the heart of betrayal and the strength of the human spirit, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Join our community so you don't miss the next journey we take together. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Who did you find more chilling? Victor, the man who pushed his own wife, or the architect, the woman who ordered it from the shadows? Drop your thoughts below, because the conversation is just getting started. Thank you for watching, and remember, the view only gets better once the haunting stops.